Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the Reading Corner with MooseChangerPat. That's me, in case you're wondering. Today we are reading Chapter 14 of Pawn of Prophecy by David Eddings, and as always, you should buy the book to support the original work. Chapter 14. It was snowing the following morning, and Aunt Poll, Silk Barrack, and Mr. Wolf again met for council with the kings, leaving Geryon in Dernick's keeping. The two sat near the fire in the huge hall with the thrones, watching the 24 or so bearded Cherrick warriors who lounged about or engaged in various activities to pass the time. Some of them sharpened their swords or polished their armor, others ate or sat drinking, even though it was still quite early in the morning. Several were engaged in a heated dice game, and some simply sat with their backs against the wall and slept. "These Cherricks seem to be very idle people," Dernick said quietly to Geryon. "I haven't seen anyone actually working since we arrived, have you?" Geryon shook his head. "I think these are the king's own warriors," he said just as quietly. "I don't think they're supposed to do anything except sit around and wait for the king to tell them to fight someone." Dernick frowned disapprovingly. "It must be a terribly boring way to live," he said. "Dernick," Geryon asked after a moment, "did you notice the way Barrack and his wife acted toward each other?" "It's very sad," Dernick said. "Silk told me about it yesterday. Barrack fell in love with her when they were both very young, but she was highborn and didn't take him very seriously." "How does it happen that they're married, then?" Geryon asked. "It was her family's idea," Dernick explained. "After Barrack became the Earl of Trailheim, they decided that a marriage would give them a valuable connection. Merrill objected, but it didn't do her any good. Silk said that Barrack found out after they were married that she's really a very shallow person, but of course it was too late by then. She does spiteful things to try to hurt him, and he spends as much time away from home as possible." "Do they have any children?" Geryon asked. "Two," Dernick said, "both girls, about 5 and 7. Barrack loves them very much, but he doesn't get to see them very often." Geryon sighed. "I wish there was something we could do," he said. "We can't interfere between a man and his wife," Dernick said. "Things like that just aren't done." "Did you know that Silk's in love with his aunt?" Geryon said, stopping to think. "Geryon!" Dernick's voice was shocked. "That's an unseemly thing to say." "It's true all the same," Geryon said defensively. "Of course, she's not really his aunt, I guess. She's his uncle's second wife. It's not exactly like she was his real aunt." "She's married to his uncle," Dernick said firmly. "Who made up this scandalous story?" "Nobody made it up," Geryon said. "I was watching his face when he talked to her yesterday. It's pretty plain the way he feels about her." "I'm sure you just imagined it," Dernick said disapprovingly. He stood up. "Let's look around. That'll give us something better to do than sit here gossiping about our friends. It's really not the sort of thing decent men do." "All right," Geryon agreed quickly, a little embarrassed. He stood up and followed Dernick across the smoky hall and out into the chamber. "Let's have a look at the kitchen," Geryon suggested. "And the smithy, too," Dernick said. The royal kitchens were enormous. Entire oxen roasted on spits, and whole flocks of geese simmered in lakes of gravy. Stews bubbled in cart-sized cauldrons, and battalions of loaves were marched into ovens big enough to stand in. Unlike Aunt Paul's well-ordered kitchen at Falder's farm, everything here was chaos and confusion. The head cook was a huge man with a red face who screamed orders which everyone ignored. There were shouts and threats and a great deal of horseplay. A spoon heated in a fire and left where an unsuspecting cook would pick it up brought shrieks of mirth, and one man's hat was stolen and deliberately thrown into a seething pot of stew. "Let's go someplace else, Dernick," Geryon said. "This isn't what I expected at all." Dernick nodded. "Mistress Paul would never tolerate any of this foolishness," he agreed disapprovingly. In the hallway outside the kitchen, a maid with reddish blonde hair and a pale green dress cut quite low at the bodice loitered. "Excuse me," Dernick said to her politely. "Could you direct us to the smithy?" She looked him up and down boldly. "Are you new here?" she asked. "I haven't seen you before." "We're just visiting," Dernick said. "Where are you from?" she demanded. "Sandaria," Dernick said. How interesting. Perhaps the boy could run this errand for you, and you and I could talk for a while. Her look was direct. Dernick coughed, and his ears reddened. The smithy? He asked again. The maid laughed lightly. In the courtyard at the end of this corridor, she said. I'm usually around here someplace. I'm sure you can find me when you finish your business with the smith. Yes, Dernick said. I'm sure I could. Come along, Garion. They went on down the corridor and out into a snowy inner courtyard. Outrageous, Dernick said stiffly, his ears still flaming. The girl has no sense of propriety whatsoever. I'd report her if I knew to whom. Shocking, Garion agreed, secretly amused by Dernick's embarrassment. They crossed the courtyard through the lightly sifting snow. The smithy was presided over by a huge black-bearded man with forearms as big as Garion's thighs. Dernick introduced himself, and the two were soon happily talking shop to the accompaniment of the ringing blows of the smith's hammer. Garion noticed that instead of the plows, spades, and hoes that would fill a Sandarian smithy, the walls here were hung with swords, spears, and war axes. At one forge, an apprentice was hammering out arrowheads, and at another, a lean, one-eyed man was working an evil-looking dagger. Dernick and the smith talked together for most of the remainder of the morning, while Garion wandered about the inner courtyard, watching the various workmen at their tasks. There were coopers and wheelwrights, cobblers and carpenters, saddlers and candlemakers, all busily at work to maintain the huge household of King Enheg. As he watched, Garion also kept his eyes open for the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak he'd seen the night before. It wasn't likely that the man would be here where honest work was being done, but Garion stayed alert all the same. About noon, Beric came looking for them and led them back to the great hall where Silk lounged, intently watching a dice game. Enheg and the others want to meet privately this afternoon, Beric said. I've got an errand to run, and I thought you might want to go along. That might not be a bad idea, Silk said, tearing his eyes from the game. Your cousin's warriors dice badly, and I'm tempted to try a few rolls with them. It'd probably be better if I didn't. Most men take offense at losing to strangers. Beric grinned. I'm sure they'd be glad to let you play, Silk, he said. They've got just as much chance of winning as you do. Just as the sun has as much chance of coming up in the west as in the east, Silk said. Are you that sure of your skill, friend Silk? Dernick asked. I'm sure of theirs, Silk chuckled. He jumped up. Let's go, he said. My fingers are starting to itch. Let's get them away from temptation. Anything you say, Prince Keldar, Beric laughed. They all put on fur cloaks and left the palace. The snow had almost stopped, and the wind was brisk. I'm a little bit confused by all these names, Dernick said, as they trudged toward the central port of Val Alorn. I've been meaning to ask about it. You, friend Silk, are also Prince Keldar, and sometimes the merchant Ambar of Kotu, and Mr. Wolf is called Belgarath, and Mistress Paul is also Lady Pulgera of the Duchess of Arat. Where I come from, people usually have one name. Names are like clothes, Dernick, Silk explained. We put on what's most suitable for the occasion. Honest men have little need to wear strange clothes or strange names. Those of us who aren't so honest, however, occasionally have to change one or the other. I don't find it amusing to hear Mistress Paul described as not being honest, Dernick said stiffly. No disrespect intended, Silk assured him. Simple definitions don't apply to Lady Pulgera, and when I say that we're not honest, I simply mean that this business we're in sometimes requires us to conceal ourselves from people who are evil as well as devious. Dernick looked unconvinced, but let it pass. Let's take this street, Beric suggested. I don't want to pass the Temple of Balar today. Why? Garion asked. I'm a little behind in my religious duties, Beric said with a pained look, and I'd rather not be reminded of it by the High Priest of Balar. His voice is very penetrating, and I don't like being called down in front of the whole city. A prudent man doesn't give either a priest or a woman the opportunity to scold him in public. The streets of Val Alorn were narrow and crooked, and the ancient stone houses were tall and narrow and overhanging second stories. Despite the intermittent snow and the crisp wind, the streets seemed full of people, most of them garbed in furs against the chill. There was much good-humored shouting and the exchange of body insults. Two elderly and dignified men were pelting each other with snowballs in the middle of one street to the raucous encouragement of the bystanders. "They're old friends," Beric said with a broad grin. "They do this every day all winter long. Pretty soon they'll go to an alehouse and get drunk and sing old songs together until they fall off their benches. They've been doing it for years now." "What do they do in the summer?" Silk asked. "They throw rocks," Beric said. "The drinking and singing and falling off the benches stays the same, though." "Hello, Beric," a green-eyed young woman called from an upper window. "When are you coming to see me again?" Beric glanced up, and his face flushed, but he didn't answer. "That lady's talking to you, Beric," Garion said. "I heard her," Beric replied shortly. "She seems to know you," Silk said with a sly look. "She knows everyone," Beric said, flushing even more. "Shall we move along?" Around another corner, a group of men dressed in shaggy furs shuffled along in single file. Their gait was kind of curious, swaying from side to side, and people quickly made way for them. "Hail, Lord Beric," their leader intoned. "Hail, Lord Beric," the others said in unison, still swaying. Beric bowed stiffly. "May the arm of Baelor protect thee," the leader said. "All praise to Baelor, bear god of Eloria," the others said. Beric bowed again, and stood until the procession had passed. "Who are they?" Dernick asked. "Bear cultists," Beric said with distaste. "Religious fanatics." "A troublesome group," Silk explained. "They have chapters in all the Alorn kingdoms. They're excellent warriors, but they're the instruments of the high priest of Baelor. They spend their time in rituals, military training, and interfering in local politics." "Where's this Eloria they spoke of?" Garion asked. "All around us," Beric said with a broad gesture. "Eloria used to be all the Alorn kingdoms together. They were all one nation. The cultists want to reunite them." "That doesn't seem unreasonable," Dernick said. "Eloria was divided for a reason," Beric said. "A certain thing had to be protected, and the division of Eloria was the best way to do that." "Was this thing so important?" Dernick asked. "It's the most important thing in the world," Silk said. "The bear cultists tend to forget that." "Only now it's been stolen, hasn't it?" Garion blurted as the dry voice in his mind informed him of the connection between what Beric and Silk had just said and the sudden disruption of his own life. "It's the thing that Mr. Wolf is following." Beric glanced quickly at him. "The lad is wiser than we thought, Silk," he said soberly. "He's a clever boy," Silk agreed, "and not hard to put it all together." His weasel face was grave. "You're right, of course, Garion. We don't know how yet, but somebody's managed to steal it. If Belgarath gives the word, the Alorn kings will take the world apart stone by stone to get it back." "You mean war?" Dernick said in a sinking voice. "There are worse things than war," Beric said grimly. "It might be a good opportunity to dispose of the Angarax once and for all." "Let's hope that Belgarath can persuade the Alorn kings otherwise," Silk said. "The thing has to be recovered," Beric insisted. "Granted," Silk agreed, "but there are other ways, and I hardly think a public street's the place to discuss our alternatives." Beric looked around quickly, his eyes narrowing. They had by then reached the harbor, where the masts of the ships of Cherrick rose as thickly as trees in a forest. They crossed an icy bridge over a frozen stream and came to several large yards where the skeletons of ships lay in the snow. A limping man in a leather smock came from a low stone building in the center of one of the yards and stood watching their approach. "Ho, Krendig!" Beric called. "Ho, Beric!" the man in the leather smock replied. "How does the work go?" Beric asked. "Slowly in this season," Krendig said. "It's not a good time to work with wood. My artisans are fashioning the fittings and sawing the boards. but we won't be able to do much more until spring. Beric nodded and walked over to lay his hand on the new wood of a ship prow rising out of the snow. Krendig is building this for me, he said, patting the brow. She'll be the finest ship afloat. If your oarsmen are strong enough to move her, Krendig said, she'll be very big, Beric, and very heavy. Then I'll man her with big men, Beric said, still gazing at the ribs of his ship. Garion heard a gleeful shout from the hillside above the shipyard and looked up quickly. Several young people were sliding down the hill on smooth planks. It was obvious that Beric and the others were going to spend most of the rest of the afternoon discussing the ship. While that might be all very interesting, Garion realized that he hadn't spoken with anyone his own age for a long time. He drifted away from the others and stood at the foot of the hill watching. One blonde girl particularly attracted his eye. In some ways, she reminded him of Zubret, but there were some differences. Where Zubret had been petite, this girl was as big as a boy, though she was noticeably not a boy. Her laughter rang out merrily, and her cheeks were pink in the cold afternoon air as she slid down the hill with her long braids flying behind her. That looks like fun, Garion said as her improvised sled came to rest nearby. Would you like to try? She asked, getting up and brushing the snow from her woolen dress. I don't have a sled, he told her. I might let you use mine, she said, looking at him archly, if you give me something. What would you want me to give you? He asked. We'll think of something, she said, eyeing him boldly. What's your name? Garion, he said. What an odd name. Do you come from here? No, I'm from Sandaria. A Sendar? Truly? Her eyes twinkled. I've never met a Sendar before. My name is Maidie. Garion inclined his head slightly. Do you want to use my sled? Maidie asked. I might like to try it, Garion said. I might let you, she said, for a kiss. Garion blushed furiously, and Maidie laughed. A large red-haired boy in a long tunic slid to a stop nearby and rose with a menacing look on his face. Maidie, come away from there, he ordered. What if I don't want to? She asked. The red-haired boy swaggered toward Garion. What are you doing here? He demanded. I was talking with Maidie, Garion said. Who gave you permission? The red-haired boy asked. He was a bit taller than Garion and somewhat heavier. I didn't bother to ask permission, Garion said. The red-haired boy glowered, flexing his muscles threateningly. I can thrash you if I like, he announced. Garion realized that the redhead was feeling belligerent and that a fight was inevitable. The preliminaries, threats, insults, and the like would probably go on for several more minutes, but the fight would take place as soon as the boy in the long tunic had worked himself up to it. Garion decided not to wait. He doubled his fist and punched the larger boy in the nose. The blow was a good one, and the redhead stumbled back and sat down heavily in the snow. He raised one hand to his nose and brought it away bright red. It's bleeding, he wailed accusingly. You made my nose bleed. It'll stop in a few minutes, Garion said. What if it doesn't? Nosebleeds don't last forever, Garion told him. Why did you hit me? The redhead demanded tearfully, wiping his nose. I didn't do anything to you. You were going to, Garion said. Put snow on it. And don't be such a baby. It's still bleeding, the boy said. Put snow on it, Garion said again. What if it doesn't stop bleeding? Then you'll probably bleed to death, Garion said in a heartless tone. It was a trick that he learned from Aunt Paul. It worked as well on the Cherrick boy as it had on Darun and Runderig. The redhead blinked at him and then took a large handful of snow and held it to his nose. Are all Sendars so cruel? Maidie asked. I don't know all the people in Sandaria, Garion said. The affair hadn't turned out well at all, and regretfully he turned and started back toward the shipyard. Garion, wait, Maidie said. She ran after him and caught him by the arm. You forgot my kiss, she said, threw her arms around his neck, and kissed him soundly on the lips. There, she said, and she turned and ran laughing back up the hill, her blonde braids flying behind her. Beric, Silk, and Dernick were all laughing when he returned to where they stood. You were supposed to chase her, Beric said. What for? Garrett asked, flushed at their laughter. She wanted you to catch her. I don't understand. Beric, Silk said, I think that one of us is going to have to inform the Lady Polgara that our Garrett needs some further education. You're skilled with words, Silk, Beric said. I'm sure you ought to be the one to tell her. Why don't we throw dice for the privilege, Silk suggested. I've seen you throw dice before, Silk, Beric laughed. Of course, we could simply stay here a while longer, Silk said slyly. I rather imagine that Garion's new playmate would be quite happy to complete his education, and that way we wouldn't have to bother Lady Polgara about it. Garion's ears were flaming. I'm not as stupid as all that, he said hotly. I know what you're talking about, and you don't have to say anything to Aunt Paul about it. He stamped away angrily, kicking at the snow. After Beric had talked for a while longer with his shipbuilder, and the harbor had begun to darken with the approach of evening, they started back toward the palace. Garion sulked along behind, still offended by their laughter. The clouds, which had hung overhead since their arrival in Val Alorn, had begun to tatter, and patches of clear sky began to appear. Here and there, single stars twinkled as evening slowly settled in the snowy streets. The soft lights of candles began to glow in the windows of the houses, and the few people left in the streets hurried to get home before dark. Garion, still loitering behind, saw two men entering a wide door behind a crude sign depicting a cluster of grapes. One of them was the sandy-bearded man in the green cloak he had seen in the palace the night before. The other man wore a dark hood, and Garion felt a familiar twinge of recognition. Even though he couldn't see the hooded man's face, there was no need for that. They had looked at each other too often for there to be any doubt. As always before, Garion felt the peculiar restraint, almost like a ghostly finger touching his lips. The hooded man was Asherak, and though the Murgo's presence here was very important, it was for some reason impossible for Garion to speak of it. He watched the two men only for a moment, then hurried to catch up with his friends. He struggled with a compulsion that froze his tongue, and then tried another approach. Beric, he asked, are there many Murgos in Val Alorn? There aren't any Murgos in Cherrig, Beric said. Angaraks aren't allowed in the kingdom on pain of death. It's our oldest law. It was laid down by old Cherrig Bare Shoulders himself. Why do you ask? I was just wondering, Garion said lamely. His mind shrieked with the need to tell them about Asherak, but his lips stayed frozen. That evening, when they were all seated at the long table in King Enheg's central hall with the great feast set before them, Beric entertained them with a broadly exaggerated account of Garion's encounter with the young people on the hillside. A great blow it was, he said in expansive tones, worthy of the mightiest warrior, and truly struck upon the nose of the foe. The bright blood flew, and the enemy was dismayed and overcome. Like a hero, Garion stood over the vanquished, and like a true hero, did not boast nor taunt his fallen opponent, but offered instead advice for quelling that crimson flow. With simple dignity, then, he quit the field, but the bright-eyed maid would not let him depart unrewarded for his valor. Hastily she pursued him, and fondly clasped her snowy arms about his neck, and there she lovingly bestowed that single kiss that is the true hero's greatest reward. Her eyes flamed with admiration, and her chaste bosom heaved with newly wakened passion. But modest Garion innocently departed, and tarried not to claim those other sweet rewards the gentle maid's fond demeanor so clearly offered. And thus the adventure ended, with our hero tasting victory, but tenderly declining victory's true compensation. The warriors and kings at the long table roared with laughter and patted the table and their knees and each other's backs in their glee. Queen Islana and Queen Silar smiled tolerantly, and Queen Peren laughed openly. Lady Merrill, however, remained stony-faced, her expression faintly contemptuous as she looked at her husband. Garion sat with his face aflame, his ears besieged with shouted suggestions and advice. "Is that really the way it happened, nephew?" King Rodar demanded of Silk, wiping tears from his eyes. "More or less," Silk replied. "Lord Barrick's telling was masterly, though a good deal embellished." "We should send for a minstrel," the Earl of Selene said. "This exploit should be immortalized in song." "Don't tease him," Queen Perez said, looking sympathetically at Garion. Aunt Paul did not seem amused. Her eyes were cold as she looked at Barrick. "Isn't it odd that 3 grown men can't keep one boy out of trouble?" she asked with a raised eyebrow. "It was only 1 blow, my lady," Silk protested. "And only 1 kiss, after all." "Really," she said. "And what's it going to be next time? A duel with swords, perhaps, and even greater foolishness afterward." "There was no real harm in it, Mistress Paul," Dernick assured her. Aunt Paul shook her head. "I thought you at least had good sense, Dernick," she said. "But now I see that I was wrong." Garion suddenly resented her remarks. It seemed that no matter what he did, she was ready to take it in the worst possible light. His resentment flared to the verge of open rebellion. What right was she to say anything about what he did? There was no tie between them after all, and he could do anything he wanted without her permission if he felt like it. He glared at her in sullen anger. She caught the look and returned it with a cool expression that seemed almost to challenge him. "Well?" she asked. "Nothing," he said shortly.